A regional analyst is reporting major recruiting violations from one of the Big 12's top schools. This is a Locked On Big 12 Locked On Cougars crossover.
You are Locked On Big 12, your daily podcast on the Big 12 Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Thursday, everybody. Welcome into a Locked On Big 12 Locked On Cougars crossover. I'm Drake Toll from America's #1 Big 12 podcast, Locked On Big 12. Thank you for making this show your first listen every single day. That is Jay Catch of Locked On Cougars, covering all things BYU. We will start an analyst saying that BYU is promising players NIL money they can't deliver on, and this sends shockwaves across the entire Big 12 as these recruiting violations could put the Cougars in a tough spot. Are they true? We'll start there, then go Texas Tech, #1 recruiting class in the country out of the transfer portal. Are they the team to beat in the Big 12? Who else can compete, and is BYU behind the punch in that category? Also, this rivalry, the Holy War, BYU-Utah, has it gone too far? We'll hit that at the end of the show. If you hit subscribe, we get to keep our jobs, and that would be very, very nice starting 2025. Jake, off the rip here, it was a Locked On Utes podcast, and JT Wistersill, the host, was not necessarily pushing this propaganda himself, but had a guest on who was a Rivals recruiting reporter who said that BYU is involved in some nefarious things, promising NIL money, not delivering on those promises, and recruiting illegally. The conversation stemming around BYU taking Utah players. If this is true, it sends shockwaves across the Big 12, and that's question number one. Is this true?
Okay, here's the deal, Drake. If it were true, the NCAA would be nailing BYU's you-know-what to the wall, because BYU is one of those schools the NCAA loves to peg for anything they possibly can. So if there were recruiting violations going on, Drake, I believe the NCAA would have already come down hard on the Cougars. I know that BYU's been under NCAA inquiry when the NIL rules first emerged. Them in Miami were kind of on the forefront of NIL and getting into it. And they, as a result, the NCAA looked pretty closely into what BYU was doing. Since that time, though, everything I've heard, and I keep my ear pretty close to the ground on this, nothing to that level has come across my desk. Let's just put it that way.
For BYU and Utah, obviously this rivalry is one thing that's going to spark a lot of this conversation. But we're talking about a guy who gets paid to cover recruiting. We're talking about a report he believes it's founded. Is there, to me, is there any way that we could corroborate BYU having some sort of tampering with Utah players specifically? That seems to be the case here that a lot of Utah fans are making. Is it valid that BYU is going after Utah students, specifically Utah football players specifically?
Sure, why not? Everybody else is doing it. That's the reality of the transfer portal, Drake, is everybody is going after everybody's players. Now, it's not coaches directly contacting players by and large. That would obviously be the most egregious. You would get popped for if the NCAA caught wind of that. But we've got third parties. We've got agents. We've got parents. We've got high school coaches. They are the go-betweens among these entities, and they're talking to the players. They're conversely talking to opposing coaches, and that's where a lot of this, I think, gets tied up in terms of who's doing what, who's cheating, who may be doing this quote-unquote nefarious type activity that BYU's alleged to have been doing. I'll just say this also. I know the person who's involved in this. I've actually known him for quite some time. He is a Utah guy through and through, and I could say that I've heard allegations going the opposite way from people that I would be inclined to believe. So here's the overarching theme I want to pass along to everybody. Everybody is messing with everybody in college football. It just so happens that if a team like BYU takes a player, let's say if Keanu Tanavasa's ability, who is a very, very good defensive tackle, an NFL type guy, it's going to obviously ruffle some feathers, and I think that's where a lot of this stems from.
Jake, I'm reading a Bro Bible article that I tagged, that I bookmarked prior to us hopping on here, that says that the title, BYU head coach accused of tampering with Utah football players during suspicious handshakes. News to me that the coach would shake the hand of opposing players post-game, but it specifically labels, it says, coincidentally, Carson Ryan and Keanu Tanavasa were two players that Kalani Sitake sought after the game against Utah and shook their hands, and now a couple months later they've transferred to BYU. Where is the connection here? Do you think that he's seeking these players out because he wanted to poach them in the transfer portal?
Okay, sure. And it's heart of hearts. Maybe he was thinking it'd be great to have these guys play for me. But I can tell you the relationships between Carson Ryan and Keanu Tanavasa, in particular with Kalani Sitake, they go back years. Both of those guys were recruited by BYU out of high school, and the Cougars would have absolutely been over the moon to have landed both of them coming out of high school. Ryan ultimately went to UCLA for a spell, then to Utah for 1 year, is now back in Provo, close to his hometown. The other thing with Keanu Tanavasa is he's been very clear, and his dad more so actually on social media has been very clear that it's a feeling for him, a spiritual type feeling for him. That he feels like he needs to go to BYU, and as he said on their BYU TV show, BYU Sports Nation, he wants to be his 100% most authentic self, and that's what he believes he can do at BYU. So yes, there is relationships, and there are long-standing relationships between these families and Kalani Sitake, but I don't believe for a second that circumstantial evidence of him shaking their hands after the Utah game is him saying, hey, by the way, in about 6 weeks' time, you're coming to Provo with me, okay?
Yeah. There are reports across the country every offseason that this school is illegally talking to this player. And to be honest with you, I mean, I looked into this recently. I as a Baylor graduate, could direct message Jake Retzlaff today, completely within my rights, and say, Jake, if you go to Baylor, there will be $5 million in NIL waiting for you. And I mean, that kid's going to probably respond to that message, right? See, and maybe Jake Retzlaff won't, but you get the hypothetical here that there are middlemen across the country. You were their strength and conditioning coach outside of high school, and you trained them when they were a kid, and now you're a BYU fan and you want to slip some money. It went from the SEC doing it behind our back to everyone in college football doing this. And it seems like, JT Wistersill, host of Locked On Utes, will make the case during the Big 12 squad tonight that this is something happening across college football, likely happening with BYU fans or donors and some Utah players. I won't say it won't. Is there anyone reporting, though, Jake, right now, anyone legitimate reporting that BYU coaches in season or outside of their window are targeting Utah players?
No, I'll just be upfront about it. I'm very good friends with a lot of the guys in the media here. I've worked around this program for a decade plus, almost 15 years now, Drake. And let's just put it this way. If there was something going on with BYU, I know at least two guys who I trust implicitly would have already reported on this, and there's been nary a word from either of those two individuals. Now, other people could break that news, but there's been nothing substantiated in my mind that indicates BYU's doing anything nefarious. But JT makes the right point. This is happening across the country, and I think it's more of just being upset about your rival taking guys from your team. And that obviously lends itself to you being a little salty about the overall situation, maybe making what I would consider as unsubstantiated rumors.
How have BYU fans, media members, players, coaches, anyone you've heard from reacted to these rumors in the last couple of weeks?
Very poorly. Let's be very upfront about it. Here's the thing. This gentleman, he's got a reputation, and there are people who love and hate him. I get that. But BYU fans, by and large, they have been reacting very negatively to it, and that's to be expected. The bigger point to be made here is...
To clarify there, it's the reporter, not JT.
JT is a prince of a human being, and I will stand up for my guy JT. We called high school football games when he was first getting into broadcasting. It's been incredible to watch him rise in through the ranks and doing what he's doing with Locked On Utes. Talk about the other reporter who was on Locked On Utes with him. The situation is that the BYU fans, they're going to circle the wagons and they're going to protect their own. And I completely understand it. Conversely, Utah, they're going to circle the wagons around their guys and obviously protect each other. This is a rivalry. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit, Drake. It exists 24/7, 365 days a year, and it permeates every facet of life here along the Wasatch Front.
There's no Christmas truce in the Holy War. We will get there later. Coming up, Texas Tech #1 in the transfer portal. Are they the biggest threat to BYU or to Baylor or to Iowa State or anybody else to win the Big 12? This is a Locked On Big 12, Locked On Cougars crossover, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by Rocket Money. Now, look, I'm going to shoot you straight. I am the ripe age of 23 years old, and I don't really know what to do with money. I'm currently in the home buying process, and I have learned that money is like a big thing you're supposed to keep track of. I got my first credit card a month ago. I grew up in Arkansas. They told you never get a credit card. I did it finally. And as I'm learning, Rocket Money has helped me so much save the thing that I need the most, and that is money. It's a personal financial app It helps find and cancel unwanted subscriptions. Now, look, I'll be honest with you. Sometimes I'm reading a sponsor read, and I'm like, okay. No, I downloaded Rocket Money, canceled 4 subscriptions because I downloaded Rocket Money and used their subscription canceler. $500 million in canceled subscriptions have been saved by those who use Rocket Money. For me, that is the best feature, and I canceled my extra Adobe Premiere and even found a fraudulent subscription that wasn't actually Google, though labeled that way. Cancel unwanted subscriptions. Reach financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. Rocketmoney.com/lockedon. That is rocketmoney.com/lockedon. Visit them and do it today. Jay Catch of Locked On Cougars. Let's talk the grand scope of the Big 12 and who already looks good for 2025. Texas Tech lands the number 1 portal class in the country. Posted a graphic about it yesterday. We know Arizona State brings a lot back. Iowa State brings a lot back. Colorado still got Deion Sanders. Baylor brings a lot back. There are a slew of teams in that 7 to 8 range from this past season that all look deadly. Who would BYU be most worried about in 2025?
It's a really good question, and funny you should bring this topic up, Drake. I had Chris Level. We did a crossover ahead of the BYU basketball game, and we talked about this very topic. And I think I came down to it during that conversation. The team I'm most worried about is I'm looking at Kansas State. And I know that sounds crazy, but think of what Chris Kleiman has done. He just really kind of operates, kind of flies under the radar, but has sneaky good pickups. And obviously the developmental program of what Kansas State does, bringing their guys up through the ranks via high school and JUCOs, like they do a really, really good job. I've got a sneaking suspicion that Kansas State's ultra motivated. They had a really bad back half of the season here in 2024. I think they got a lot of motivation to get it right in 2025. So speaking from the BYU perspective, I'm worried about K-State. And the other team I am keeping an eye on, I am wary of Texas Tech. They have thrown a lot of money around in the NIL sphere. And yeah, I would believe that they would substantiate themselves as maybe the number 1 portal class. And that should be an interesting thing because as Chris Level talked about, the whole thing with what they've done with Joey McGuire is they've tried to go the high school route and develop guys, and now they're kind of pushing the chips in on the transfer portal, trying to jumpstart things here. So very interesting times down there in Lubbock. We'll see where it all goes.
Is there a worry for BYU fans? I want to talk about a couple of different Big 12 teams over the course of this segment. Is there a worry for BYU fans only bringing in 7 transfer portal commits? Currently 24/7 has BYU as 15th in the Big 12.
There was some concern because BYU got a very slow start in the portal, Drake. I think you were paying attention to it as well. They just did not get anybody for the first 2 weeks of the portal season. And trust me, I was hearing howling from all corners of Cougar Nation about they're not doing anything. Jake, what's going on? The other side of it is BYU brings a lot of pieces back. Think about it. They bring their quarterback, their entire running back core is coming back. We'll have to see on the junior college side of things with guys like Darius Lassiter, Caleb Etienne, as well as a guy like Maury Bamba. If they get all those guys back, BYU's pretty well stocked. And quite frankly, with that, they don't have a lot of spots, especially with the roster cuts downs that are going to be coming to college football at the FBS level. So I look at it. I think BYU, by my math, Drake, had maybe 10 to 11 spots to add transfer portal guys. So currently sitting at 7 to 8 guys, they only got a few more spots. So I think if you consider the circumstances, BYU's done what they were expected to do.
Colorado is right back up there at the top, and they were sitting with BYU in the first week, 10 days of the transfer portal, both schools with only 1 or 2 commitments. And I wondered if the Buffs, who brought in 40-plus players last year, had lost their touch in the portal. Now, they bring a lot back themselves. What they really needed was a quarterback that got that in Caden Salter and finished with the second back. I say finished. There are still some – you can still move and shake here. We'll see the spring transfer portal class as well. But they're second in the Big 12 per 24/7. Is Colorado's Deion Sanders proving that the transfer portal can be a plug and play to win football games?
Well, if you look at the record from this past season, I think he proved that very point. And I think the bigger thing is that Deion is a guy who believes that he can kind of mix and match. He believes he's like the ultimate motivator. Give him whoever he wants, he'll get him into the program and he'll mold them into the best version of themselves. I think that's what he sincerely believes about this program. And I can't argue with the results from this past year. Now, BYU did wipe the floor with the Buffs in that bowl game, and that was a really impressive performance for BYU. But beyond that, Colorado had a really, really fine season. A Heisman Trophy winner on that roster, Drake. So I don't think you can argue with the results. And if Dion, once again, I think the case study will be this year. If he can turn it over, you mentioned Caden Salter, maybe Juju Lewis ends up taking that quarterback job away from him at some point next year. If Colorado proves they can continue to kind of just turn this roster over every single year and have success, you'll see more and more programs start to buy into the Deion Sanders philosophy.
The Utah Utes. They are 5th in the Big 12 in the transfer portal, again, per 24/7. Landed a big 4-star commit as well. And the goal is to reload. They lost a lot of guys, including to the BYU Cougars. Is Utah a scary team? Not just for the Big 12 next year, but for BYU, knowing, and we'll get deeper into this, but knowing the rivalry, are they a scary team for the Cougs?
There's always a concern because these are, like I said, they're arch rivals for a reason. They like to get after one another. The thing about it is, BYU learned their lesson via the portal year one in the Big 12, Drake. They turned their roster over. More than half of the guys on that 23 roster were newcomers, and BYU never really gelled that season and struggled on the way to a 5-7 record. I'm not going to lie. I look at what Utah's got going on, all the bodies they're bringing in, particularly on offense. Jason Beck, as a new offensive coordinator, has got a lot of work to do to get all those guys on the same page. He is a former BYU quarterback. He's done a lot of good things at multiple levels of football. This may be his biggest challenge to date. I'm interested to see how it goes, but I have massive concerns that they may have similar struggles to like BYU did in 2023.
I am overjoyed. I think we can confidently say, to me at least, that the Big 12 has won the transfer portal because the bottom 4 teams in this conference, you have to have 4 teams at the bottom, by the way. You can't, that's how rankings go. Kansas State, Arizona State, BYU, Iowa State. What they all have in common is they won last year and they bring a lot back. Positive attrition. Those schools will have 6 to 10 guys leave, probably for the better for everybody involved, and they don't need to bring in a whole slew of guys to compete next year because they're growing products both from the portal from a year or two ago and from the high school ranks. What I do like to see, what I do think should scare the rest of the Big 12, is Baylor at 8th in the conference, 11 commits, 3, 4, 5 of those being plug-and-play guys, or, Jake, plug-and-compete guys. Yeah. That may be the best part of the transfer portal is putting some pressure under a guy who's been there for 2 years to pony up and play better or lose their spot in the starting lineup. Seeing Baylor at 8, and I'm about as cynical as they come about Baylor football, do you feel as though the Bears are a sneaky Big 12 championship pick next year?
I do consider them to be a sneaky pick. Here's the deal. Dave Aranda has been under a lot of pressure, and you and I have talked about this both on and offline a lot about the pressure he's been under. They responded very well last year. Sawyer Robertson was a major surprise overall. He had, I think his big coming out party, frankly, was against BYU, and kind of picked up from there and rolled the rest of the way. If they can get good quarterback play, Baylor can make it a nice run here. I like what you said, though. Plug and compete. BYU had a former Baylor Bear in their own right, and Gary Bohannon come in and really push Jake Retzloff, and it made Jake Retzloff a better version of himself, and obviously helped BYU propel themselves to 11-2 this past year. That's a major thing. You need to have guys who feel like they're being pushed so they can become the best version of themselves. BYU followed a similar philosophy, I think, with a lot of guys they added via the portal. Now, I think a few more of them are probably plug and play because they're probably coming in to start. Guys like Andrew Gentry, where BYU has a dearth of talent at tackle, offensive tackle, I should say. He probably gets to start right away, but you need to have guys come in and push other guys on the roster because complacency can set in, and that will absolutely cripple a program like a Baylor or a BYU.
Yeah, I would say for Cincinnati in that 12 range and Houston in the 9, they're in different spots to me, but Cincinnati being at 12th in the Big 12 is not a good sign. I didn't have a lot of confidence in Scott Satterfield coming into this season. The fall apart there at the end wasn't very positive for the Bearcats, and them being in that 12 spot. I'm looking for that to be overhauled. I want Cincinnati to perform the way that UCF or Kansas did in the transfer portal this offseason to rebuild a roster that needs a lot of new pieces. They didn't do that. I would say that, as we've talked about competitors, Cincinnati would be that one team that I really circle as probably not great. Do it, Jake. Come on. Talk that talk.
Let me just interject this. Cincinnati may have had the quietest and least impactful transfer portal season that I can recall across the Big 12. And that's not a good sign if you're a Bearcats fan, because I'm with you. I wasn't all that high on Scott Satterfield going to Cincinnati. I don't think it's been what they expected. And he's probably on borrowed time if he doesn't really course correct very quickly.
Well, they're a year away from pulling a UCF or West Virginia and rehiring Luke Fickell. Bring him back. Coming up, the rivalry with Utah and BYU. Has it gone? It's the best in the Big 12. I think we can all agree on that. Has it gone too far? This is a Locked On Big 12. Locked On Cougars crossover, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. That is Jake Hatch of Locked On Cougars, Drake Toll of Locked On Big 12. If you hit subscribe, we get to keep our jobs, by the way. The best rivalry in the Big 12, bar none, it is BYU and Utah, the holy war. But now Utah fans or analysts are claiming that BYU is tampering in recruiting with Utes players to get them to Provo, as they've landed a couple from the portal. And BYU fans are saying that Utah fans are nasty, cheating liars. I mean, this has gone back and forth. And Jake, this was a big rivalry 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 5 years ago. But today, it feels as hot as I've seen it, as these two teams are now in conferences in close confines. And has this gone way too far?
I don't think it's gone too far. Here's the deal, Drake. This rivalry goes back well over 100 years. Have I told you the story about how the first intercollegiate matchup between BYU and Utah ended?
Jake, here's the deal. I've learned 90% of people who watch Locked On Big 12 on YouTube aren't everydayers. So 10% of these people probably know the story. 90% will hear it for the first time.
So this is back in the late 1800s. BYU and Utah, their first intercollegiate matchup was a baseball game. How did it end? A benches clearing brawl.
Yeah.
Yes, that is this rivalry in a nutshell. From the very get-go, it has been at each other's throats, literally and figuratively. And that's the thing about this. These two fan bases love to poke at each other, and it's like two siblings who just simply can't get along. Hey, he's looking out my window. Well, you're looking out my window. Hey, you're poking me. Hey, I work in sports radio here in Salt Lake City, Drake, and I don't mind saying that the rivalry, it programs 60-70% of our shows throughout the year. And I'm not talking just college football season. It goes, as I mentioned earlier, 24/7, 365. It is a year-round rivalry, and it permeates literally every facet of life. You can have your next door neighbor as a Utah fan where you may be a BYU fan, and all you guys do is essentially burn a wire of you into each other's grass all year long and just get after one another. You put up a flag on the side of their house. It is in everything along this along rivalry lines here in Utah, and it is absolutely unique.
Is there another? I want to continue talking about the rivalry itself, but from the Big 12 perspective, is there another rivalry in this conference that even comes close?
I would say the Territorial Cup to a level, because the Arizona schools are so linked together just with what they've done for so long down there. The other one that I would kind of consider to be close to it, it's not as well known, but it's one that you're very familiar with. I like to call it the rivalry. TCU and Baylor, they like to get after each other. It may not be on the same level as BYU and Utah, but that's a good one. And the other one I will mention is Farmageddon. Iowa State, Kansas State, they love to get after one another, but all three of those, they just don't match up to the overall vitriol. And it's legit vitriol that exists between Cougar and Ute fans. I
do love a good Farmageddon. I went for the first time this last year, and it's just cool. Those two schools hate each other. They both have in-state rivals, but they really, really hate each other. And I wish that Brett Yormark would make that an annual game. Going back to this year's version of BYU and Utah in the Holy War, fans throwing trash on the field. And to play it both ways, BYU player.
We had a felony come out of that this year, by the way. Did you see that story?
Right, that's right. Who hit the cheerleading coach, right, with a water bottle?
Yeah, clear on in the face, knocked her out, and now is facing a felony charge. So that's always fun.
So it brought out the worst of the rivalry, which brings up the question, has it gone too far? And then the athletic director from Utah comes to the podium and says, we were happy to be here, now we're not. Kyle Whittingham throws a chair, but BYU players are stomping in the Utah end zone post-game, right? Celebrating not with their teammates, but by taunting Utah fans. So phone works both ways. Both sides were certainly, I don't want to say completely equally at fault, I'll put it that way, but at fault nonetheless. Jake, does a matchup like that show that this rivalry is as heated as it's been in a very long time?
Absolutely. They're in the same conference once again. And then, by the way, the stakes are even higher than they ever have been before, because both of these programs now have that door open to making the college football playoff and thereby having a chance to win a national title. BYU fans love to point at the fact that they have a national championship trophy in Provo, Utah, and Utah fans, it burns them. It absolutely chaps their hides to have that shoved in their face. To have that door open for both of these programs, if one can get over on the other at any level, even if it's not a championship level, if they can get one past their rival, they will take every opportunity to do that. That's players, that's coaches, that's administrators, and the lay fans themselves.
Jake, for the first time, this rivalry is being played and I know college football has shifted, right? Used to conferences were a bit more spread out and they fluctuated. In today's college football, there is a very clear Power 4. Now BYU and Utah are not only in the same conference, but in the same power conference. It's called the Power 4 for a reason. How has that, adding these two schools to the Big 12, created a new dynamic in a very old rivalry?
It's essentially you just made the stakes in terms of how people perceive things even more like one-sided, depending on which side you're on, if that makes sense. They want nothing more than to watch, if you're a Utah fan, to watch the Cougars fall flat on their face. Trust me, I am seeing Utah fans with BYU struggles in basketball right now, Drake, saying, hey, guess what, BYU? We could suck like you do, but we do it for a lot less money, because they're obviously thinking of the AJ DeBonsa deal and the multiple millions of dollars BYU is thought to have been paying him to sign with the Cougars. Here's the deal. These two, they love nothing more than sticking it to one another. No matter how seemingly small that slight may be, they will make a mountain out of a molehill and give them just 5 minutes and they can do it.
Jake, I like Utah owns the record. I mean, Utah owns the record by a pretty solid margin. I know these schools based decade to decade have gone back and forth, but how do BYU fans respond when a Utah fan says, hey, we own the all-time series by a lot?
Well, they'll point to the first 20 years, Ike Armstrong. Okay, here's the deal. BYU has had long stretches where they dominated the rivalry, but Utah has the longer stretches because BYU didn't win a game in this rivalry since BYU claims it started in 1922. Now, we have matchups in the 1890s that BYU doesn't claim that BYU actually won. So I don't know why they don't claim those, Drake, because actually help out, even up that record just a little bit. But the bigger thing is, for the first 20 plus years of this rivalry, BYU, the best they could do was tie that game. They could not win it. When they finally broke through, they tore down the goalposts, cut them up into little pieces, and to this day, they are all over in Cougar Nation. I have seen multiple pieces of those goalposts from the 1940s that are still floating around. It is a rivalry that it burns deep for everybody involved in it, and I, for one, I love it. I know there's a lot of fans out there on both sides who say, yeah, it's probably gone too far, and they don't like the vitriol with it. I can tell you that with it having Power 4 stakes now, it has raised it to another level, and it's only getting better in my mind.
I'm going to phrase this question in an odd way and then kind of come back around. How does this rivalry help TCU, Cincinnati, UCF, Houston? How does it help Colorado? How does it help Baylor? How does this rivalry help the Big 12?
I think the biggest thing is it can bring eyeballs from afar because, as we all know, BYU's got an international fan base with its affiliation with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm telling you, Drake, you posted a thing of where the eyeballs for your podcast not too long ago, and a lot of them came from Utah. If I were to do a similar one, Drake, I could tell you I will have international spots show up on those charts because people listen and tune in from all over the world. And they also... Cougar fans like to hate watch / hate read everything about Utah at the same time. So the extra eyeballs that are drawn because of this rivalry to the conference as a whole, it's going to help everybody because they will pay a little more attention to a Cincinnati. They're going to pay attention to UCF. They're going to pay attention to West Virginia because those are future opponents that BYU and Utah have to play. So it's going to bring extra eyeballs, and just the fact that these fans are so curious about their new conference home, they're going to do extra research, and that's going to bring extra attention to the conference as a whole.
Jake, where can folks find more of your work?
If you want to follow all things BYU, check out Locked On Cougars wherever you get your podcast. It's also on YouTube. I'm having a great time talking BYU every single day. And if you want my thoughts on all things sports, my Twitter handle, if you're watching this on YouTube, is right down there. It's Jacob C. Hatch, or the show. You can find it as well. Locked On Cougars on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram as well.
That is Jake Hatch of Locked On Cougars. This has been, and it always will be. Make sure to follow along the rest of the week as we'll be covering all things football and basketball across this conference, and specifically with the Cougars. Locked On. Thanks for making it your first listen every single day. Dose Grande.